Hi, welcome to the Temple Deep Learning Podcast. In today's episode, we will be looking at temples and sacred architecture. I am your host, Brett Holbrook. Thanks for tuning in. On this episode, we will not be having any guests, as we will be looking at more material than usual for this topic. Going back to look again at ancient roots of temples and the terms used to describe them, this time we're going to look at the New Testament, which of course was written in Greek. There is a reference to the temple as a house. In John 2, verse 16, it states, "And said unto them that sold doves, Take these things hence, make not my Father's house an house of merchandise." The word here in Greek that's used for house is oikos, which means house or dwelling. It's used only 14 times in the New Testament in referring specifically to the temple. The word temple in English is found in the King James Version of the New Testament 115 times, mostly regarding Herod's temple. The two main Greek words translated as temple are hieron and naos. Now, taking a look at the first one, we will look at Matthew 4, verse 5. It states, "Then the devil taketh him up unto the holy city, and setteth him on a pinnacle of the temple." This is the word hieron. It's used 71 times in the New Testament, and it means temple or a sacred place. It is used usually to refer to the entire enclosed area of the temple complex, the whole area. In Luke 1, verse 9, it states, "According to the custom of the priest's office, his lot was to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord." Now, this is the usage of the word naos, which is used 42 times in the New Testament to mean temple, but specifically the inner sanctuary of the temple. That would refer to the holy place and the Holy of Holies. That's why in this verse it refers to burning incense. It's only the inner part of the temple where God resides. The root for naos means to dwell or inhabit, and so it kind of relates to the house of God, and again, the place where God dwells. It is also found 16 times in the book of Revelation as denoting the place before the throne of God. So again, it is the holiest part of the temple. It is also the term that is used to refer to the body as a temple. In John chapter 2, or as Paul uses it in 1 Corinthians 6, the holy place where God dwells. Now here's a diagram of Herod's temple, which basically shows the inner sanctuary and some of the outer courtyards. So that inner place is the naos, right, as the temple of God. But hieron is used to describe all of the precincts of the temple. Here's another diagram that again shows Herod's temple, but more of the courtyards. In fact, in that lower left-hand corner, you can see the pinnacle of the temple. That would be the pinnacle referred to in scriptures where Jesus was asked to cast himself down from. And again, it's referring to that part of the temple that's in the complete outer section, the outer part of the complex. These two words also help us kind of understand their differences in how it applies to certain scriptures. For example, in Matthew 21, verse 12, here's the use of hieron. "And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves." So this helps us understand as hieron, it wasn't in the inner sanctuary, that the money changers were in the outer courtyard. In Matthew 23:35, it states that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. Now, this also helps us understand because the altar, of course, was outside the inner precinct or the holy place and holy of holies. And so the altar is in the precinct, but not in the sanctuary proper. And so this was the use of the term naos. Now, it's interesting that while Jesus is in mortality in the New Testament, he is always in the hieron, never in the naos, as he wasn't functioning as a priest at that time. So there's another term used for temple in Greek. It's outside of the New Testament, though, and it's the term temenos. Where we find it is that it's used by Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews and Wars of the Jews. And he uses this term to describe the temple. Now, first of all, you have to understand a little about who Josephus is. He was one who was born in Jerusalem to a priestly family, and he initially fought against the Romans during the first Jewish-Roman wars, the head of the Jewish forces in Galilee, until surrendering in 67 AD in Galilee to the forces led by Vespasian. And now he told him that the emperor Vespasian, that Jewish messianic prophecies referred to him becoming the emperor of Rome. So Vespasian decided to keep Josephus as a slave and presumably as an interpreter. And then after he became emperor in 69 AD, he granted Josephus his freedom. And so Josephus assumed the emperor's family name. So he fully defected to the Roman side and was granted Roman citizenship. But by doing this, he went with the Roman armies and he was able to observe all the things that happened to Jerusalem and, in fact, to the temple. So when he describes the temple, he uses this term temenos, which means an area marked off to separate it from common use, a sacred precinct dedicated to God as an area for worship. So the important part of temenos is that it's marked off. It actually includes the enclosed sacred space of the hieron. Now, why is this word important? Because the root of temenos in Greek, which means marked off sacred space, comes from the Greek temnion, which means to cut or mark. So that's why you get that sense of cutting or marking off. It also, temnion, tends to be the root for the Latin term templum. Now, templum in Latin means a consecrated space marked for taking observations. Now, why are we moving from Greek to Latin? Because that's where we get the word temple from. In English, temple is a place dedicated for worship of deity. It's taken from the root templum. It's also important to note that the word template, a pattern or a gauge, is also taken from this root word, which also has its own implications regarding the temple. Now, I know this is looking back at at the language and some of the roots, but there's a reason for it. So templum in Latin, again, a consecrated space marked for taking observations. It is found 126 times in the Latin Vulgate. And the Latin Vulgate was the Old Testament and New Testament translated into Latin by Jerome, about 400 AD. We get such phrases as Templum Dei, the temple of God, or Templum Domini, meaning the temple of the Lord. The word is found earliest in classical literature, and it had cosmic associations. Now, a templum was created by cutting the ground in two intersecting lines at right angles. The two lines were called the cardu and decumanus. Now, that is the basis for the creation of Roman cities. Among the ancient Romans, the templum was the site where signs from heaven were interpreted. Now, looking at the Dictionary of Greek and Roman Antiquities, it states that the templum had a twofold meaning. The space of the sky, which the augur marked off by imaginary lines, which were the cardu from north to south and the decumanus from east to west, thus dividing the space into four regions. There's a specific way of dividing and cutting the space, in essence. Number two, the space of the earth to be included for observations, which was a rectangular space bounded by points as the limits of observation in each direction. This space also was divided into 4 regions by lines, the Cardo and Decumanus, where these imaginary lines intersected. So it's interesting, a templum was a place to take observations of the earth and sky. Further, in the place where the observer was to sit, the observer pitched a tent called the tabernaculum, also quadrangular in shape with a single opening, commanding the spaces of earth and sky which formed the templa. Now, hopefully, in looking at that ancient definition, you can see how it relates to how we understand the temple today, its connection with sky and earth, and for making observations. Now, this isn't unusual even in the latter days. Here's a diagram on what would be an example of the Cardo and Decumanus and the tabernaculum that's created in the space that's cut into 4 directions. In essence, the 4 cardinal directions. Once in Utah, the early saints gathered. In this dispensation, they began to build the Salt Lake Temple. But as they did that, there was always another structure on what would later become and be called Temple Square. You can notice in this picture of the temple being built that that red box is around this little building that was there. And it was actually there before the temple was built. But it was built right alongside of where the temple would be. Here are just a couple of other pictures to take a look at it. Again, as the temple is going up, and you see this certain building that's in that same place. Here it is once the temple is finished. It's kind of hidden by trees, but you see that same building there. Now I want you to see that's what this building looked like. Well, what was this building all about? This building was Orson Pratt's observatory. It was a building right there on Temple Square in which Orson Pratt took cosmic observations. Okay. Here's inside the observatory, and I just want you to see the stone. It's kind of a little bit in a U shape at the top on which the telescope sits that, again, Elder Pratt made observations from. That same stone can be found today on Temple Square because it's that same stone, it's that same place these observations were made that we get the meridian base. It's what measures the mountain time, and it measures the exact location, latitude, and longitude from which they would measure out the entirety of Salt Lake City. It's where they would take geological surveys. They're measured from this stone base. And it was in the observatory just south of the temple. And it's from the southeast corner that Orson Pratt surveyed all of Salt Lake City Valley. It seems appropriate that Utah's earliest observatory should have been placed next to the temple that spiritually unites heaven and earth, and it's where we make observations. The other idea of the templum is that the center point was seen traditionally as the navel of the earth, the cosmic mountain or sacred tree or pole, known as the axis mundi. Now, the definition of the axis mundi is the world axis. It's a line or stem through which the Earth's center connects its surface to the underworld and the heavens around which the universe revolves. There are many examples of the axis mundi in history, or what certain civilizations and even faiths would look at as kind of this center pole. In Japanese culture, it would be Mount Fuji, the Dome of the Rock at the temple, Mecca in Islam, the Black Hills for the Sioux Indians. They're all examples of this belief in the axis mundi, a perceived center of the world where heaven and earth are connected. This concept is also known by other names, including the world tree, the world pillar, and the cosmic axis. Mircea Eliade, a fairly famous author on the subject of the sacred and profane, stated that the 3 cosmic levels, earth, heaven, the underworld, have been put in communication. This communication is sometimes expressed through the image of a universal pillar, axis mundi, which at once connects and supports the heaven and the earth. Here's a diagram that basically shows what the axis mundi does, that it has these three levels, that we're here on earth, but yet there's the heavens above and the dead beneath, but this axis connects it all together. An example historically, Jerusalem was known as the navel of the earth, and early maps, actually like this one, depicted Jerusalem as the very center of all things. Probably even in popular culture now, with Marvel movies and the such, we might know about Norse history, about Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil is called the world tree. It's an axis mundi. It connects everything together, where we have Midgard, which is in the middle, being earth, and above it is Asgard, which is the realm of the divine, and then below it are the other realms and the realms of the dead. And so thus, again, we have an axis mundi. Richard Oman, who is the senior curator of the Museum of Church History and Art, stated, "The temple represents the axis mundi, the center of the world around which the earth pivots. As the axis mundi, the temple is the earthly end of a great shaft connecting the center of earth to the center of the heavens. As an axis mundi, the temple fulfills its essential role as the conduit between heaven and earth, God and man, a place where the Lord communicates with his children." Here are a few temple pictures of the interior that give you some of the symbolism of the architecture to give you the sense of an axis mundi, the sense of the connection. So first, in the lower right, of course, we have a baptismal font, which always extends down into the ground to represent baptisms for those that are in the realm of the dead. And then as we go in other rooms in the temple, what we're known as the creation room, it would be on a different level, a little bit up from the realm of the dead. As you would go into that next picture on top of that, into the celestial room, the ceiling extends higher than in the other rooms. And in fact, in the upper right, you see an example of the celestial room in the San Diego temple, which beautifully has a symbolism, because you see in the celestial room, you have a staircase that goes up to the ceiling rooms, representing that even that is higher. And of course, on that upper left, that's part of the towers in the Manti temple, where you can go up these stairs to an even higher ceiling room. And so you get this sense by elevation going through these three different realms. Here's a diagram that was taken from a paper written about the design of the Rome, Italy temple. And in here, the author talks about the axis mundi. Again, with the grave or realm of the dead, and that's where the baptismal font is down below. You have the earth represented in the middle, and then the heavens represented above. And again, this idea that that's what a temple does. It connects all these realms together. Here's another picture of a cross-section of the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania temple, just to give you another idea. You can see the baptistry in the middle where it sinks down below other things. And then above the dressing rooms are the chapel, the creation room, the terrestrial room that leads to the celestial room that again has a higher ceiling. It goes up higher, and above these are, of course, the ceiling rooms. So symbolically, you see this correlation of how a temple is the axis mundi and connects all these levels together. Now, the Salt Lake Temple is one of the greatest examples of the idea of axis mundi, as it reinforces the concept of connecting earth and heaven cosmically and in time. So looking at first at a couple of these pictures, at the base of each of the temple's buttresses are what are called earth stones. And you can see by that circle that within that circle, you kind of see a convex shape of a roundness that's sitting there. Now, this represents an earth stone. You can't really see it here, but I want you to take a look at this diagram. This is Truman O. Angel's 1853 drawing of an earthstone that was to be at the Salt Lake Temple. And it shows, obviously, a map of the world, and it shows the longitudinal and latitudinal lines and all the continents standing out in bas relief. The original plan for the Salt Lake Temple was to have the earth stones represent the earth as though it were revolving on its axis as you walked around the temple. It would show different latitudes and longitudes in different places on earth as you walked around the temple. This scheme visually reinforced the interpretation of the temple as the center of the earth as you walked around. Now, of course, with the change from softer stone to granite, prevented these carvings from being on the Salt Lake Temple. But this was the purpose of it. But those are just the earth stones. There are moonstones on the Salt Lake Temple. You can see in this diagram that different phases of the moon are represented again as you walked around the temple. And with their locations, it actually mapped out the 12 months of the year. You kept this lunar calendar again as you walked around the temple. You see in those below pictures, you see the 4 phases of the moon that it represented. Higher up on the Salt Lake Temple are suns, right? They're suns, and each one has 40 rays, which was the equivalent in the Bible, of course, of a biblical generation. So it's all, again, the representation of time. Above the suns, you have stars. On the east towers, you have all of these stars that are higher up. Now, in looking at, of course, these earth stones, you got moonstones, you got suns and sunstones, and you've got the representation of stars, we think immediately, section 76 and the 3 degrees of glory. Well, while each of those symbols may be represented as such, the way that they're placed on the temple, where the sun isn't the highest kingdom on the temple, it really points to this cosmic orientation of what we see as we proceed from Earth to the moon, to the sun, and then to the stars. In fact, as you see here on the West Central Tower, you see a collection of stars that are there, and can you recognize it? It's the Big Dipper. If you have a hard time seeing it, just to represent it a little bit better, you have the Big Dipper, which of course points towards the North Star. And so as you walk around the temple, you have all of this orientation that points ultimately to the North Star that, of course, doesn't move in the heavens. So here's an example of how these different representations of cosmic symbols are placed on the Salt Lake Temple. You will have at its base the earth stones, a little higher up the moonstones, even more higher up the sunstones, and then stars. And above that, then, is the Big Dipper and looking into the sky at the North Star. So as the earth stones revolve around the temple, the moonstones do so at the same time, depicting the moon going through its 4 phases. In fact, it was selected, it was the 4 phases of the year 1878 over those 12 months. Above them, the sunstones circle the temple. The star stones of the Ursa Major point to the North Star, around which all heavenly bodies appear to rotate. The representation, again, the temple is that axis mundi, and it is cosmically oriented. And you have this all over the Salt Lake Temple. Now, of course, was this representation intended? Yeah. At the temple's corner laying ceremony, Parley P. Pratt spoke of the connecting role of the temple, and this is what he stated. He said, "Ye are assembled here today and have laid these cornerstones for the express purpose that the living might hear from the dead, and that we may prepare a holy sanctuary, where the people may seek unto their God for the living to hear from the dead, and that heaven and earth and the world of spirits may commune together." So the temple is the meeting point of 3 cosmic regions: heaven, earth, and the realm of the dead. Now, here's another example that obviously comes to mind when you think about moon and sun and star stones, is the Nauvoo Temple. And so take a look at them. And it's also in that same order that you get on the Salt Lake Temple. You have the moonstones at the base, then further up the sunstones, and above those, the star stones. Other temples, I'm going to show you a bunch of examples right now. Again, this isn't every temple, obviously, with so many on the earth today, but it helps you see this cosmic orientation as part of the symbolism, which is included on many temples. Here you have moonstones at the Mount Timpanogos Temple, the Portland Temple, the Las Vegas, Nevada Temple, and look at this window pane from the St. Louis, Missouri Temple. You have in 6 different pyramid sections, different phases of the moon as it goes through them. Also, the Preston, England Temple has moonstones, the Palmyra, New York Temple, the Bountiful, Utah Temple, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. So again, the same type of cosmic symbolism can be seen in other temples. Well, what about sunstones? Mount Timpanogos Temple, St. Louis, Missouri Temple, Palmyra, New York Temple, and of course our own Newport Beach, California Temple. We have these designs of sunstones. Star stones, Mount Timpanogos Temple, Palmyra, New York. You can see certain temples are carrying all of these symbols all the way through. The Albuquerque, New Mexico Temple, and even on the spires on top of the Portland, Oregon Temple, you see these stars that are embossed, that are there to represent, again, this whole cosmic look as a temple connects heaven and earth. The Washington, D.C. Temple, this is a panel from the front door of the Washington, D.C. Temple. And notice what's on it. You have the North Star and the Big Dipper. So again, you have that same example of those stars that are placed upon the Salt Lake Temple here on the Washington, D.C. door. Anchorage, Alaska Temple, actually, this serves a couple purposes, because not only is the Big Dipper, of course, part of the Alaskan flag, but it's here on the side of the temple. Now, I know it's kind of hard to see here, except for perhaps the North Star and the mid-left section, but let me put where the stars are on the stone there. You can again see the Big Dipper and the North Star on the temple being represented. So, why are we looking at all this? Because, again, remembering the definition of templum, it's the spaces of earth and sky which form the templa. So it's not only on the earth, but it's also in the sky. And the sky, the circle of the horizon, is usually represented as a circle, where when you get the Decumanus and the Cardo and these north, south, east, west lines, it forms more of a square, which represents the earth. And these become great symbols as part of the architecture on temples. Part of the sacred architecture deals with the circle and the square. Circle represents the heaven, and the square represents the earth. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at what are the instruments that draw these shapes, well, it's the compass in which you draw the circle for the heavens. And it's a builder's square by which you draw a square that represents the earth. Now, just a moment on a compass and a square. This is actually represented through many different cultures in a sacred way. For example, you look at this picture on the right. These are the Chinese mythological gods. Don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but I think it's Nuwa and Fuxi, as they hold tools in their hands. You see the king and queen embracing, it's at their wedding, the king holding the square on high and the queen a compass. As it is explained, the instruments are taking the measurements of the universe at the founding of a new world and a new age. Again, the compass and the square. You see a couple of these other artistic depictions of Jehovah, Jesus, each time with the world in his hand and a compass in hand by which he is taking measurements. These are probably a little bit more familiar to you. The one on the left is, of course, a Masonic symbol. You find it on many gravestones and Masonic buildings. And you have this representation of the compass and the square. But what is really interesting, if you look at the weather vane that was on top of the Nauvoo temple originally, that on the top of the weather vane, above the angel, representing the angel Moroni, you have a compass and a square. Now, this is from the drawing that was done of the weather vane by William Weeks. Above the angel is the symbol of the square measuring down and the symbol of the compass measuring up. Now, notice that's opposite of the Masonic symbol, which I think it's correct because, again, the compass is going to measure the heavens and the square is the one that measures the earth. Scholar Matthew Brown has suggested that since the compass, which is used to draw circles, it points towards the bowl of the sky, and that the square, which is used to draw squares, points towards the earth, and that the combination of the two symbols represent the powers of God in creating the bowl of the starry heavens and the four corners of the earth. So you get those representations symbolically. So the circle and the square, heaven and earth, this becomes a fairly universal symbol for the temple when we're looking at, again, what's representing the heavens and what's representing the earth. So now we're going to look at quite a few temples in this dispensation that show the circle and the square, just kind of as a sampling. We've already looked at, of course, the Salt Lake City temple. And here in the upper left corner, you, of course, have those earth stones, which when you see it, it is a circle and a square. But higher above, on the Salt Lake Temple, it's clear circles within squares that are part of the architecture of the Salt Lake City Temple. Let's look at the Palmyra, New York Temple. You clearly see circles in squares that are around the upper parts of the Palmyra Temple. The Monticello, Utah Temple. This one's interesting because you see squares within squares, and also circles within squares. In the lower picture, it's harder to see, but you can even see in the windows circles inside of squares. So you start to, if you take notice, on many temples, you'll see this representation, and it's a symbol. And what does it say to you? Well, the temple is a place where heaven and earth meets. Here's the Las Vegas, Nevada temple. Where it states holiness to the Lord, the house of the Lord, you clearly have two squares with a circle inside. And even similar representations of those sunstones on other parts of the Vegas temple. Here's the Bountiful, Utah temple. You have circle and square representations all over the place, not only in large relief, but all along this border. You have windows that have the circle and square design that is upon the temple. And in the upper right-hand corner, you even see the doors of the Bountiful Temple. Again, circles within squares. Here's the Birmingham, Alabama Temple. Circles and squares in both stone and in windows. The Fukuoka Temple in Japan. Again, you see this representation of circles and squares. And even, this one I want you to notice on the Dallas, Texas temple, notice on the fence that surrounds it at the top, circles within squares. Now that's going to be similar in many temples, what they'll do with that outward gate. The Hermosillo, and again, I'm going to butcher a lot of these names, Mexico temple, you can see circles that are adorning it. In addition to designs of squares with circles within them. Louisville, Kentucky temple. Again, not only on the temple, the circles and squares, both in stone and on windows, but again, the outer fence also holds that symbol. Anchorage, Alaska temple. Again, here are just three different pictures of the representation of circles and squares. Again, in stone and in glass. Here's the Toronto, Ontario temple. Going along the main story of this Toronto temple, you can see circles and squares. And even the other Canadian Saskatchewan temple, you see this representation in stone and in glass right below it of circles and squares. Here's an interesting one from the Draper, Utah temple. Here's just a picture of one of the chairs, and I thought I'd include it because it's just clearly the back of the chair is circle within a square. But also when you look at the ceiling, look at this pattern of the circle within a square. There's so many places around the temple, exterior and interior, that you're going to see this circle square example representing heavens and the earth. The Fresno, California temple. Again, not only along the side of the temple in stone, but look at the gate and how, again, it's representing that same design. Columbus, Ohio temple. You have that representation on metalwork. You have it on stone surrounding the temple. Here's the Medford, Oregon temple. Again, pictures of that representation, circle within the square. The Columbia River temple in Washington. You notice the circle within a square, and it's almost given like an earthstone feel in how it's convex in shaping of the circle. But take a look at this window that shows a circle around a square and circles within a square all up and down this window pane. Melbourne, Australia. Again, representation of those symbols. Stockholm, Sweden. Just this main thing with the top spire right below it, the Lord's house. And here you have again a circle within a square. The Washington, D.C. temple. All of these reliefs are put in circles within squares on the door of the Washington, D.C. temple. Albuquerque, New Mexico. Again, it's a diamond shape, but you have the square and you have the circles embedded in it. Now, why do I put the Provo, Utah temple here? Even though the Provo, Utah temple is undergone change and it looks different now, but from the air, when you look down on the Provo temple and how it was, it's a circle within a square. Mount Timpanogos, we looked at many examples of it. They have circles and squares all over it. The Suva, Fiji temple also represents it. And I love these on the Portland, Oregon temple. And because they were around the base, not only do you see these large reliefs of a circle embedded in a square, but look down at the very bottom at the roses along the base, just all along those lines, circles within squares. Now, of course, our beautiful Newport Beach temple. You see those sun reliefs are set in squares. You have circles and squares. But it's not only there. In the windows, circles and squares going around the perimeter, up and down columns, circles and squares on the exterior. Now, if you've seen enough of circles and squares, I've got one more example for you. And it's actually the circle and double square or 8-pointed star. Now, you've probably heard of this, and some have called this the Seal of Melchizedek. Members are excited about this because the symbol is all over the San Diego temple. Now, there are some facts, but quite a bit of fiction and rumor also around this symbol. But I want you to notice how it pertains to what we're talking about. Even as you see this picture, the two squares, by how they're interlocked, make a circle in the middle. But it's often also represented with a circle. So what do we know about this symbol? As far as the San Diego temple, there was a fireside by one of the architects, and rumors about the symbol went forward. The architect has stated that the design did not come to him in a dream, but it was an architectural detail they desired to find that worked, and it was used uniformly in the temple design and construction. Some have claimed that general authorities or the scholar Hugh Nibley himself identified it with Melchizedek in personal conversations or in books. So just to take a look at this, this becomes the source of where we get the association with Melchizedek. This is a relief. This is found on a 520 AD mosaic in the Basilica of Saint Apollinaire in Ravenna, Italy. Melchizedek is also in this. He's the one standing in the middle. So this symbol here at the right became associated with him, this interlocking of the squares, and you even see the circular design in the middle. This drawing is found in the book Temples and Cosmos, which is a collection of writings by Hugh Nibley, but the illustration is written by Michael Lyon. And this is how it's represented, of course, in his drawing. Now, Lyon also wrote the caption for publication, and it reads in part, "The white altar cloth is decorated with the so-called seal of Melchizedek, 2 interlocking squares." And that's really the phrase where we get seal of Melchizedek from. The source of the connection of the symbol with Melchizedek is Michael Lyon, and he stated that he used the term so-called to suggest caution about putting too much stock in the name or the seal's connection with Melchizedek. He stated at another time that it may have been Nibley who inserted the word so-called before the term seal of Melchizedek, perhaps indicating his hesitancy at the name. He said Nibley was aware of the symbol and said it is a very interesting thing, but don't get too excited about it. Nibley gave him no notes or correction for the caption. Lyon thought he had once seen the design in a book on Catholic symbolism, but he doubted the legitimacy of the name or title, and the reference has never been found. Many claim that Nibley associated it with Melchizedek, but there's no evidence that substantiates it, just rumor and innuendo. There's another version of the same mosaic in the city of Ravenna in the Basilica of Saint Vital. There, the symbol is seen, but Melchizedek's not central. He's at the side. So, is it really associated with Melchizedek? And here you can clearly see the circle inside the 2 interlocking squares. This is not to say that the symbol has no importance. President Hinckley mentioned the design in the dedication of the San Diego Temple. And then President Hinckley also had the symbol placed on the lobby doors of the Salt Lake Temple. The symbol has been included on other temples as well. So, whether it's associated with Melchizedek or not, I think we can really look at it as the symbols of the square and the circle and why it would be associated as a temple symbol. So, here are the 3 symbols from Italy, or the 2 symbols of Italy plus the design. And here are just 6 examples of how it's used on the San Diego, California temple. Inside, outside, on the ground, on the gates. It is everywhere. The importance, again, is its association of the circle and the square. Here is some of the lobby doors as you enter the temple. You can see how many times they use these interlocking squares. And again, this seems to form and looks like a circular part that's in the middle. Now, scholar Jeff Bradshaw, in an email to Bruce Hammond in 2008, wrote this. He said, "To me, the intersection of the circle and square are most satisfactorily explained in the terms of the coming together of heaven and earth in both sacred geometry of the temple, which might be equated to the culminating blessings that follow as an eventual consequence of having received a fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood. The shape, with its focus on the circle, referring to the heavens, and the square, referring to the earth, forms the foundation of the traditional view that the cosmic ritual structure brings heaven and earth together. The fully rendered figures of the circle and the square manifest in their completeness what the tools of the compass and the square symbolize only in anticipation." So that quote basically summarizes most of what we're talking about when we're looking at some of these symbols and some of the cosmic meanings of the architecture of the temple. Circle and double square. Let's just look at some of the examples. San Diego Temple. You see it on the outside. You see it on windows. I think someone mentioned that there are over 10,000 instances of this symbol on the San Diego Temple. So you see it on the sides. We saw this just a little bit earlier, the glass door where it has all those symbols. The outside in stone, where you see the interlocking squares and the circle that it creates. You see the square and the circle on the upper parts of the temple. You see it on the glass, even as you look below in that lower picture. You see it in the San Diego temple in the ceiling. I mean, that's an intricate design with the interlocking squares, and also on the floor. Again, what looks like the interlocking squares with the circle right in the middle. It's on the outside. It's in the pavement. It's on the driveway around. It's even part of the landscaping and the flowers that you have if you look upon it from above. The circle and the square. Here is one rendering that was done in a publication just to show this pattern as you look down on top of the temple. In fact, as you do so, you see in the very middle the atrium of the San Diego temple, which has the interlocking squares and the circle right in the middle. Well, the circle and the square, it can be found in the Redlands temple in talking about this double square circle. You see it on the Redlands, California temple. Here are the doors of the Salt Lake City temple, New Mexico temple. And again, you can see it in the Newport Beach temple on the wall right before the stairs leading up to the entrance to the temple. The circle and the double square. Well, I know those were a lot of images of temples, and we kind of ran through those fairly quickly. But let's see if we can summarize. Ancient terms for the temple in Greek help identify its divisions and parameters. This continues in Latin, where we actually get the word temple from templum. It helps identify the sacred architecture of a temple and how it is a place where one gets their cosmic bearings, making observations about creation, the universe, and our place in the plan of salvation. Hugh Nibley stated, here, in talking about the temple, the four horizontal regions meet, and here the three worlds make contact. Whether in the old world or in the new, the idea of these three levels of the axis mundi and four cardinal directions dominated the whole economy of the temples and of the societies which the temples formed and guided. Put a little bit more succinctly, Elder Boyd K. Packer stated, it is at the temple that we may begin to see into the eternities. Both the building and the architecture of what we see in the temple points to this cosmic feeling that the temple helps connects us between heaven and earth. Next time you attend the temple, whether you're going on and looking on the outside or even on the inside, pay notice to many of those symbols of that sacred architecture and those things that represent heaven and earth. Thank you for taking the time to watch. We will see you next time on the Temple Deep Learning Podcast. Thank you.